Section 20 of Crime, Its Causes and Remedies by Cesare Lombroso. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information on a volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Leon Harvey. Chapter 2. Prevention of Sexual Crimes and of Fraud. Subchapter 138. Sexual crimes and crimes of fraud are the specific crimes of advanced civilization. How shall they be remedied? Subchapter 139. The Prevention of Sexual Excesses. Divorce is a powerful means of preventing a great many cases of adultery and many of those other sexual crimes that are among the saddest phenomena of modern criminality. By the statistics of Ferry, we see the convictions for adultery in France increased from 1864 to 1867, while in the same period in Saxony, where divorce existed, they decreased. And in German districts where the French law was in force, there were many more trials and separations than in the other districts, and the sexual crimes were more numerous. In France, in the period when divorce did not exist, from 1818 to 1874, poisonings among married people were more frequent than among the unmarried, 45-30. But in following years, on the other hand, they became fewer. In Italy, it is reckoned that no fewer than 46 homicides a year occur, perpetrated with the sole object of putting an end to a union that has become unsupportable. I have told of my home criminal, for them too, the case of the Clairot family, where the sons and their mother killed the father because of his continual brutal ill-treatment. In France, Mame Godfrey, 43 years of age, had won the respect and affection of the whole district for the courage in which she had brought up 9 children, but had borne for 15 years the ill-treatment of her drunken husband. But one day, when he threatened her with a knife, at the end of her patience, she killed him with an iron spade. She gave herself up and was acquitted. As regards sexual crimes in general, a considerable number are to be attributed to individual congenital tendencies, but another part, and this the greater, comes under the category of occasional crimes through the influence of the comparative barbarism of the country districts, and of passions which have no other outlet, on account of the absence of prostitution and the difficulty of marriage. For these crimes are especially to be observed in certain mountainous countries where prostitution does not exist, and among soldiers and priests. But the majority of these crimes are due to the effect of civilization. We have a proof of this in the fact of their increase in the western provinces of Prussia, where this civilization is highest, and in the fact that the sexual assaults upon children have increased 5-fold in 50 years, while those upon adults have decreased. In France, these crimes numbered 305 in 1826, and by 1882 had reached 932. The rapes upon children increased from 138 to 791, an increase of 500%. In England they numbered 167 in 1830 to 34, 972 in 1835 to 39, and 1,395 in 1851 to 55. In Prussia, according to Ottentin, sexual misdemeanors increased between 1855 and 1869, from 225 to 925, while crimes of the same nature rose from 1,477 to 2,945. Modern civilization exercises still more direct influence. By diffusing education, it increases the irritation of the nervous system, which in its turn demands stimulations and pleasure that must always be new and more keen. It seems that the more a man's psychic activity increases, the more the number of his needs and his taste for pleasure grow, especially when his mind is not occupied with great scientific and humanitarian ideas, and when his wealth permits an overabundant diet. Of all these, the sexual need is certainly that which is most keenly felt, and this is that which, for the whole animal world, is in the closest connection with the cerebral system. This relationship is sometimes one of antagonism as seen in the great fecundity of fish and the lower insects, the lesser fecundity of the higher animals, and the sterility of the worker ants and bees, and of great men, and sometimes one of parallelism, as in provided by the greatest psychic force at the period of virility and by the exuberance of health, life, and intelligence to be observed among chaste men. The insatiability with regard to pleasure in the cases of individuals of high culture, together with the abundance of opportunity, explains to us why the crimes against children increase in inverse ratio to the crimes against adults. And it further explains, together with the lack of divorce and the fact that marriages between old people are constantly becoming more numerous, the apparently strange fact that this crime, unlike all others, is most common in the case of married people. In France, the unmarried furnish 41.5% of the rapes of children, and the married men 49.5%, while in the other offences against persons, the figures are 48.1% for the unmarried and 40.4% for the married. We may add that because of the continual development of foresight, the more intelligent people are always seeking to engender the fewest children possible, and hence inclined towards pedestry. Thus it is that I have observed among the more intelligent mountaineers, at Cesare, for example, marriage postponed until the age of 40 in order to have fewer children, while in the mountains where cretinism is most abundant, in the valley of Aosta, the marriages produce, and Donaz, for example, 6.5 children, and at Chatillon 5.1, nearly double the average. It is not too bold a hypothesis to say that marriage, where wealth and influence are preferred to beauty and health, is a transaction in which the choice is made directly contrary to the laws of natural selection, and that it consequently becomes hateful and leads not only to desertion of the marriage bed, and also to hatred and disgust at the entire sex, and in consequence to a search for sexual gratification contrary to nature. This latter certainly would not be so common as sexual needs could be freely satisfied with a beloved person of the opposite sex. Civilization, in its turn, materially influences rapes upon the immature by multiplying workshops, mines, schools, and colleges, and thus furnishes numerous occasions for contact between adults, often unmarried, and the immature, among whom it is enough that one should be immoral in order to corrupt hundreds. This all explains why the workmen, who furnish, according to Fayette, 30% of the general criminality, furnish 35% of the rapes upon children. Subchapter 140. Legislative and Administrative Measures. It is very easy to follow the old military method and say, if crimes increase, let us also increase the penalties, and we shall put a stop to them. This is an exaggeration. It is, however, true that Ferry also exaggerated when, by a series of statistics for France, covering 53 years, he tries to prove the ineffectiveness of punishment, because the continual condemnations coincide with a continual increase in the number of crimes. But if we examine these tables, we shall see that if there has been an increase in the reformatory penalties visited upon those guilty of rapes upon adults, at the expense of severe punishments, 56 to 4 to 32.2 equals 1.75. On the other hand, the excessive sentences to prison over those to hard labour has diminished much more. 56.7 divided by 10.2 to 30.6 divided by 12.9 equals 2.34. A result which proves an increase in the severity of the penalty on the whole. Now, crimes against adults having diminished, it is clear that this severity has had a certain influence. Here it seems that the lighter penalties have increased at the expense of those that are more severe. Here then the severity has decreased, and we find that at the same time the number of these crimes in France has increased. The penalty then is not without its influence. Yet it is incontestable that in this case we must look to preventive measures much more than to punitive ones. For this reason the schools and the workshops where children are employed should be supervised. An excellent substitute for penal measures in the case of pedestry, for example, is to put directoresses or married women as supervisors in the workshops where children work at night. And this measure would be the more easily put in practice since it would be economically advantageous. It would also be necessary to prohibit child labour in the mines, as is done by the French law of 1874 with regard to the labour of children, a law which has been in force since 1875 and coincides with a diminution in the number of rapes upon children since 1876. Another remedy would certainly be the diffusion of prostitution in the agricultural districts, and especially in localities where there are a large number of sailors, soldiers, and labourers. It is especially necessary to make sexual intercourse accessible toward dissolute-minded young men. No law can be devised to prevent mercenary marriages, which, because of their origin, easily become repugnant. But at least a greater facility of divorce can be granted, that the antipathy may not reach the point of leading to hatred and crime. It is evident that divorce is destined to diminish the number of crimes of adultery. In the first place, it permits a legitimate sexual satisfaction to husbands, who if young and merely separated from their wives would certainly procure illegitimate satisfaction. And in the second place, it threatens the unmarried adulterer, who now runs, at most, the risk of a duel, with the far greater danger of a forced marriage with an unchaste woman. In the present state of things, the injured husband, if he has recourse in the courts, runs much more risk and is subjected to more annoyances than the true culprit, on account of the publicity and ridicule to which he is subjected, to say nothing of the chance of the eventual acquittal of the offender. Further, divorce is a preventive against crimes of vengeance on the part of the injured husband, crimes frequent on the stage, though rare in real life. And again, the new French remedy of acid throwing, it will be much better and more efficient than with the efforts of the courts. Even when the author of the crime is acquitted by the court and absolved by public opinion, he remains none the less a criminal, and the killing of an adulterer, however culpable he may be, is always a kind of wild justice, left in the hands of the injured person by customs still entirely savage. Now it is to be noted that according to Dumas, who ought to know something about it, these murders occur oftener in legitimate marriages than in cases of concubinage, because it is in the former that the need of avenging the violation of one's own legitimate property is most keenly felt. I have shown in a previous chapter that there are certain perverse natures which are irresistibly drawn towards one another. The marriage of such is happy for the participants, however harmful for society. But what of those cases where one of these depraved beings is united with a respectable person, when a satyr like the Frenchman Ferlin, who by 7 servants besides his wife had 54 children, and ended by ravishing one of his own daughters, is married to a chaste and sober woman? From such cases we see new causes and forms of crime arise. The ancient jurists, who were anything but considerate to women, admitted that a woman who was beaten by her husband could not be accused if afterwards she committed adultery. Plainly, the ancients saw in adultery a preventive against martial cruelty. Now divorce would be a better preventive. But divorce alone is not sufficient. It is necessary to insist upon investigation into the question of paternity, and above all, reparation for the woman seduced. If we cast a glance at our society, we see there, as regards the sexual instinct, two opposite currents. On the one side, sexual desires increase as intelligence and civilization increase, hence a great number of educated offenders. And on the other side, the means of satisfying this need becomes more and more difficult. It is from this fatal situation that sexual crimes arise, but the situation is aggravated by that prejudice which makes us regard that as a grave offence for one sex, which for the other is not even a misdemeanor, which makes the sexual act enough of a fault of a young man to drive him to satisfy this imperious need in his more erotic moments by acts contrary to nature. Hence we see, added to the congenital perverts, who are the inevitable effect of degeneracy, numbers of accidental perverts who need not have been made such. When then a true balance comes to be struck between the demands of nature and those of morality and duty, we shall see crimes of this character rapidly diminish. For this purpose it is necessary to make marriage less mercenary, to make legitimate sexual relations easier, to make maternity always respected, and especially to make obligatory that reparation to the woman which the law now not only does not provide, but actually prevents, by forbidding inquiry into the question of paternity. These are the true preventives, not only of sexual crimes, but also of infanticide and of many suicides and homicides, crimes which in general arise from sexual relationships, and these criminals are just those most worthy of human pity, the more so as the guilty are most often those who are otherwise respectable people. Subchapter 141. Fraud. Fraud and breach of trust are the most common crimes, and show the result of evolution and civilization upon crime, a process in which it has lost all the cruelty which characterized it in primitive ages, substituting greed and the habit of lying, which unfortunately threatens to become general among us. Thus we pass from the more retired valleys into the small towns, and from the towns to the great cities. We shall see, as we pass from small to great, the commercial lie, swindling on a small scale, take on larger and larger proportions, and the higher society under the form of financial corporations. We shall see the true, the gigantic system of swindling flourishing permanently, sheltered behind the most high-sounding and honoured, if not the most honourable names. It is then natural that the common swindler or the corrupt politician should not be a born criminal, but a criminaloid possessing all the qualities of the normal man, so that without a propitious opportunity, such an opportunity We may even say, as would be almost enough to corrupt an honest man, he would not have stumbled. Now, here we see a means of prevention by the dissemination of the modern economic truth that a bank which gives itself up merely to speculating in the product of money can only be a swindling scheme, since money cannot, of its own power, multiply itself. Further, we must demand in every case that the directors of corporate banks, having agricultural or industrial objects, shall offer effective guarantees that losses will be made good, even when a disastrous operation has been sanctioned by the stockholders. This last provision is the more necessary, since stockholders are often only convenient instruments in the hands of rogues, and are made there involuntarily and unconscious accomplices. The bankers and jewelers of London and Paris have found an ingenious method of discovering swindlers who approach them under the disguise of men of high station. They employ for this purpose dogs trained to recognize the odor of these pretended rich persons, who bathe but rarely. They make use also of the telephone, of instantaneous photography, and of the new telephotography, which transmits the image of the suspect client, as the telephone does the voice. Hence the swindler is in danger of being arrested before ever leaving the place where he attempts his fraud. But it becomes much more difficult to prevent swindling when it is protected by political or governmental power. Swindling by taking advantage of political office seems to many persons today no more a crime than the use of poison did in the Middle Ages, where not only the Borgias but also the 10 in Venice made use of it as a common political weapon. Now, from assisting a newspaper with the public's money is no one's money, to helping a friend, and then finally oneself, is but a short step, especially for those who seek to supply the lack of genius with lack of honesty. But here the institution of parliamentary government has its effect, especially through increasing the lack of responsibility. When we live under despotic government, the royal concubines pocketed the public money. Today it is the deputies who have taken their places. For these, considering themselves, like the kings, inviolable, and being even more irresponsible than the kings, naturally deny themselves nothing, unless restrained by moral sense. Find the means of putting immense treasures into the hands of men who are irresponsible and inviolable, or nearly so, and then try to kill them that they must not touch those treasures. Today the evil is so much greater as the deputies and senators are more numerous, and hence more dangerous than kings. It is easy to understand why they are more dangerous. In the electoral contest, it is not intellectual qualities and still less moral qualities that decide the victory. Far from it, the man who has new ideas simply dashes himself against the stone wall of their people's conservative prejudices. He who with a free conscience points out an evil and proposes the remedy injures the interests of some powerful voters. The respectable man who does not combat abuses openly injures no one, but he also accomplishes nothing, and all run the risk of being submerged by the mediocrity which satisfies the world with an insignificant program, or by the brazen and corrupt who buy the needed votes. It is necessary, then, to restrict the number of these representatives of the nation, to limit their power, and to remove their special privileges. In ordinary offences it is just that they should be held to a greater responsibility than others, as in England, where merely the suspicion of adultery, which for most persons does not have to be considered a crime, was enough to cause the fall of Parnell. For this reason, the largest liberty must be given to the press. In the present state of things, the guilty not only cannot be accursed, but, if they are accursed, find a new resource in their own crimes, and they can, at the expense of honest men and with the aid of the law itself, indemnify themselves for the efforts which honourable men make to expose their misdeeds. This happened in France when B, some years ago, got a young journalist convicted and heavily sentenced for revealing only a small part of the truth about Panama. Here is the place to say that in such cases to lay bare the sores is not, as some weak persons believe, to increase the evil, but on the contrary to begin the work of healing. A country which, like France, seeks to cast the light of day upon the foul places in order to purify itself, regains its rank in the estimation of the world, and in popular opinion, however high may be the station of the guilty. One of the reforms that would serve best to check political corruption would be an extensive decentralization. When a government centralized, like the Italian or the French, has the right to administer enormous sums and manage affairs involving billions, as in many of the public works, corruption inevitably arises, because the control of the public is no longer actively or directly exercised, and a wider door of impunity is left open. But if, on the other hand, the public business has to be transacted in broad daylight under the eyes of all, the control will be more efficacious, and those weak persons whom money might corrupt will find in the publicity of their acts a means of resisting evil. Panama scandals occur always in the great central administrations, and never, or in much smaller proportions, in municipal administration. The abuse of public office is thus a crime of the most advanced civilization, which can be prevented only by limiting the number and power of the deputies and senators, who are the natural protectors of corrupt officials, by its decentralization, which will permit a more active surveillance and decrease the number of monopolies, but especially by cutting down the number of officials. Russia and Italy are really governments of officials, who absorb and stifle everything that has vital force in the country, and under pretext of sustaining life destroy it. Now it is possible, in the courts for example, to replace the collective functionaries by a single judge, and thus increase the corruption more easily. By a diminution in the number of employees, it would be made possible to choose the best ones. I have proposed, for example, to choose the judges in the first place by examinations, then for the next higher grade by the number of decisions not revoked by the higher courts, and finally for the higher judges by the number of cases treated by direct citation and by the issue on appeal. This would be the most exact criterion, at the same time a great encouragement to well-doing. End of section 20.